Hello out there in Megland. Welcome to another MeG Podcast. We have the usual team here today. So we've got Richard Jeffrey Cook, Matt Haywood, and myself. This podcast topic is quite a big one, actually. So we're going to split it over two podcasts to avoid doing a ridiculously long podcast and possibly falling asleep ourselves partway through it. So this podcast will be part one. Part two will follow at some stage. I haven't got a date fixed yet. A number of things in diaries that making that a bit floating, but it will be the next one. And the subject for this pair of podcasts is the 100 Years' War, which of course lasted a bit longer than 100 years, but we all know it as the 100 Years' War. As well as the sheer length of it, we're aiming to cover more than just the two headline acts of the 100 Years' War, England and France. Across the two podcasts, we're all going to look at some of the other nations and participants in the 100 Years' War. Obviously, there's action in Spain, but there's also other things going on in the British Isles as well, so we'll look to cover those as well. So to try and do a sort of more encompassing thing than just the English and the French and the usual battles that get trotted out at this time. So in this podcast, we're going to follow the usual format. We'll have some history, some lists, talk about that. However, again, because of the sheer range of this and because we don't want to kill Richard, we're also going to split the history sort of into two. So Richard will be doing, if you like, the first half-ish of the 100 Years' War in this one. The second part will cover more of it. We're also going to sort of divide the lists up a bit into themes as well. So in this one, we will cover the English and the French. And in the second podcast, we'll cover some of the other actors in the war. So that's the plan. We hope there won't be too long a delay between this podcast and the second one in the mini-series, but it does depend on diaries and as part of that, Richard is flying out to the States to go to Historicon in a couple of weeks as well. So that's obviously we're not going to ask him to do a podcast while he's also flying the MeG flag and hopefully enjoying himself in the States. Not least because I don't want to deal with the time difference as much as anything. So maybe that's a selfish one. Anyway, as ever, enough from me. Over to Richard for potted history in his inimitable style, where he will give us some great facts, I'm sure. So, Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Nick, and hello, everyone. So, 100 Years' War. The starting point I'm going to choose for this history is actually the 1st of February 1328. This was when Isabel, who was the Queen Mother of Edward III and ruler of England at the time, with Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, forced Edward II to abdicate. Now, the significance of Queen Isabel was that she was also the sister of Charles IV, who lay dying in France. Now, Charles IV had no children, but his wife was pregnant. And what he decreed was if the child was a boy, then that child would be king. But if the child was a girl, then Philip, Count of Valois, Anjou and Maine would become King of France. So if this starts to sound like Game of Thrones, then that isn't quite coincidental, because the various conflicts of the Middle Ages were certainly an inspiration for George R.R. Martin. Anyway, back to 1328. So as it happens, that a girl was born, and so in April 1328, Philip, Count of Valois, called an assembly and was proclaimed King of France. English arguments that Isabel should become Queen of France were dismissed. And this was to set the stage for a conflict that was to continue for roughly 119 years. So the basically, this is a case where you could have made an argument for both the idea that Isabel should have inherited as queen, or equally that that it didn't make a lot of sense for Isabel to try and rule France, given that she was also away ruling England. In 1329, it's interesting, Edward III actually swears homage to Philip. So at the time, it was sort of a fait accompli, and Edward had to accept the situation. It's worth noting that Edward III was actually Duke of Guyenne in his own right, and that was one of the 12 sort of major peers of France. He was also Count of Ponthieu. Now, in 1330, Edward III actually seizes the throne from his mother and executes Mortimer for treason. He gets chopped up into quarters after the usual hanging and drawing. At this point, it's worth remembering that Anglo-Norman was still very much the living tongue and the first language of the nobility. And that was only to change sort of with possibly Edward's great-grandchildren. So it shows that at this time, the sort of Anglo-French nobility was very much intermixed. It's worth also stating that in terms of the importance of the countries, France was very much dominant compared to England. France was a rich country with a population of over 20 million at the time. England probably had a population just under 5 million. Philip basically commanded the most powerful army in Europe, and England had frankly had a pretty dismal military record since Bannockburn earlier in this century. And at this time, relations between Edward and Philip were pretty good. In 1332, the two kings even agreed to go on to crusade together. So you can't really say that there was huge hostility at that time. However, the basic situation was going to change, and over the years, Edward became more and more convinced that the throne of France had been stolen from him. The other interesting aspect to both countries was that in the kings themselves were both basically broke. Although France was very wealthy, its tax system was basically incapable of raising any funds to pay for huge military commitments. While England essentially was not particularly wealthy. In fact, in some years, actually, the income from Guyenne in France actually was greater than the income of England in its totality. So Guyenne, by the way, of course, is that bit of France in the southwest, basically from Bordeaux down to Bayonne. The 100 Years' War arguably starts actually on the 24th of May 1337, when Philip declares that the Duchy of Guyenne has been forfeited by Edward. This he claims on various grounds, some perhaps with a little justification, some entirely spurious. Edward himself responds by writing Philip of Valois, who calls himself King of France. So at this point, he is making it very clear that he does not regard Philip as the rightful heir to the French crown. And the first 3 years of the 100 Years' War basically involves the French attacking Guyenne, French ships raiding the English coast and English ships retaliating by raiding the French coast. The first invasion by the English actually takes place in 1339 when they invade France from the Low Countries. And it was the first example we have of a chevauchée. And a chevauchée was a raid basically designed to systematically devastate the countryside. Edward had tried this tactic in Scotland, and basically the English were to make an art of it in France over the following years. Basically, what Edward was doing with his first chevauchée was hoping that he would force the French to attack him when he was in a strong defensive position. Again, this was the tactic perfected against the Scots using the combination of men-at-arms and longbowmen. And it's probably hard to understate how devastating these chevauchées were. The aim was to basically burn every village you came across, loot every monastery, abbey, whatever, and basically kill anybody you could catch. And that, even in medieval times, was quite a vicious form of warfare. Certainly a long way from the chivalry that we think of with the medieval feudal system. So the war carries on for the next 6 years. Edward basically spends most of the time trying to raise funds for an army and then struggling against setbacks and then seeking out allies. A good example was getting allies with the Duke of Brittany, who had various conflicts against Valois and his allies. So in July 1346, the English land in Normandy and start a chevauchée aiming for Paris, where the French king was raising a huge army. When he sort of gets near to Paris, Edward then decides he needs to head north, and the French army heads off in pursuit. After getting very worried when he nearly got caught out crossing the River Somme, he actually gets over the Somme and has a clear route back to Calais and the Low Countries, and it is there that near Crécy, he actually prepares a defensive position and awaits the French. You can guess what's going to happen next. The French army probably at this stage outnumbers the English 3-1. However, it's certainly better equipped. However, it is not a coherent force, I think it's fair to say. Philip basically loses control of the army, and piecemeal they rashly advance, apparently claiming, "We will ride down this rabble who block our advance." Philip himself actually wanted to camp for the night, and the French attack starts just a bit before sunset, and it then goes on actually for 4 or 5 hours. It was basically dark by the time the whole battle came to an end. The French apparently charged 15 times. I think that's recorded in Froissart, one of the main sources for history of this time. And essentially, the English hold out and do the huge damage that we associated with Crécy. The English themselves actually didn't realise the extent of their victory until the following day, which gives you some idea of the confusion that occurred over the darkness. Actually, at the end of it, over 1,500 French lords and knights had been killed, which was very substantial. And it was an absolutely shattering blow to French confidence. However, Edward himself is really unable to exploit this victory, and he actually retires back to begin what becomes actually a grueling siege of the city of Calais. That goes on over the winter, with both sides suffering. There's a lot of illness around from the conditions of the siege. And in 1347, Philip himself actually brings up an army to try and relieve Calais. But the French morale was so poor that the king didn't actually dare attack the English siege fortifications, and he actually retires back towards Paris. At that point, the burghers of Calais basically curse Philip and have to accept that they can't withstand the siege anymore, and they surrender. There's the famous story of the six burghers who originally Edward basically wanted to kill the whole town, but actually agrees to, as long as they submit 6 rich burghers, he'll let the other townspeople go. And then it's actually the Queen who pleads for the 6 burghers to keep their lives. But the whole town's population was expelled and repopulated by English colonists. And in fact, for the next 2 centuries, Calais would remain part of the Diocese of Canterbury, i.e. English territory.
I didn't know it was attached to Canterbury. That's really interesting.
Yeah, then hostilities would probably have continued as viciously, but in 1348, the Black Death arrives. Bubonic plague that hits first France and then England. About a third of the population dies. I think it's very hard, even after COVID, to get your head around how devastating bubonic plague was at that time. Philip actually dies in 1350, and although he's actually remembered for his defeat at Crécy, Philip actually left France greater than he had inherited it. He negotiated a treaty to acquire Dauphine, which is where we get the idea of the Dauphin. That actually extended France right down to the Alps for the first time. He also, for example, negotiated from the King of Majorca to hold the city of Montpellier on the French coast. So, far from being an unsuccessful king, he actually did a pretty good job, but he is sadly remembered for the defeat at Crécy. The next sort of major campaign then doesn't occur until 1355. And this is when the Black Prince, who was the eldest son of Edward III, leads a chevauchée from Guyenne and right through Languedoc, actually devastating most of it almost until the city of Montpellier. So that's a huge swathe of territory. The French actually are unable to respond to that. And so in August 1356, he sets out on another chevauchée, this one aiming first going east through Limousin and Berry and then northwards. His intention was to link up with another English force that was coming down from Brittany, but that force actually got scared off. And in fact, the Black Prince actually has no intention of fighting the main French army. He's just trying to gather as much loot and do as much damage as possible. When he's actually near Tours, he actually hears that the main French army has sort of almost reached him, and he starts to head south as quickly as possible, aiming back for the safety of Bordeaux. However, the King John, who had inherited the throne from Philip, he has actually outflanked Edward and reaches Poitiers first. Again, the English, they're actually probably in a worse situation than Crécy. but all they can do is actually hold a strong defensive position, which they do just outside Poitiers. But probably fortunately for the Black Prince, the French king has arrived. The army has arrived on a Sunday, and the French king was quite religious and was persuaded to try and negotiate a settlement because it was a Sunday. Unfortunately, King John would settle for nothing less than unconditional surrender, which the Black Prince wasn't prepared to accept. So the following morning, the English actually tried to slip away, and this sort of forces the French king to attack before his army was actually properly drawn up. As soon as the French start to attack, the English know that they actually have to fight. But they have a good defensive position. They're amongst hedges. Their flanks are reasonably well protected. The first attack itself was led by 2 mounted companies. These were followed by an array of German knights, mounted knights and footmen. And this attack, the English fight off, but it's a hard-fought contest, and it wears down the English. The second attack was a division led by the Dauphin. It was repulsed, but basically by this time, all but a tiny reserve of the English army has been committed to the fight. The third division was led by the Duke of Orleans. He was brother of the French king, but for reasons which are not entirely clear, he doesn't attack, but actually withdraws on seeing the Dauphin's division being repulsed. So he basically seems to have lost his nerve and decided to get out of there. So this leaves a final attack by 6,000 dismounted French men-at-arms led by the king himself. And this force is met by everything the English have left, including all its reserves. The archers run out of arrows during this fight, and basically have to join in with the melee. What seems to have turned the day was 60 English men-at-arms who actually found a hollow that led behind the French line, and they suddenly appear from this hollow, and the French, suddenly thinking there are more English on their way, basically flee the battlefield. And King John, who probably was braver than his common sense should have said, basically with his prince, the heir to the throne, are basically suddenly find themselves fighting alone, are surrounded, and are captured. In fact, French losses at Poitiers amount probably to nearly 2,500 men-at-arms, and at least as many French were also captured by a force that, quite frankly, you get accounts of archers capturing 4 or 5 prisoners each. So the number of prisoners was so huge, it threatened actually to outnumber the English army. The ransoming of prisoners was a very lucrative exercise at this time, and it raised huge funds for English troops. So the English now find themselves holding the French king, who actually gets taken over to England. The result of the battle is that in France, central government collapses and there's complete chaos. You have basically bands of soldiers of all nationalities, including French, controlling large parts of the countryside and basically exploiting peasants and sort of extorting money from towns and all the chaos that ensued. In January 1358, the first Treaty of London is negotiated, and this cedes basically Guyenne Limousin, Poitou, Saintonge, Ponthieu, and other areas to full sovereignty of the English. That is about basically the French king has conceded at least 1/3 of French territory to the English king. However, Edward decided that that wasn't going to be enough. So, having agreed that, he then demands, on top of this, Anjou, Maine, and Normandy. This probably was never going to be a reasonable demand, and it's just a basic excuse to continue the war. And in October 1358, Edward III arrives in France himself, and in November he sets out from Calais, basically with the idea of marching to Rheims, where traditionally the King of France is crowned. So basically he's saying he wants to become King of France. Sadly for him, the French were warned, and he was unable to actually take the city of Rheims. And eventually, in October 1360, the Treaty of Brittany is agreed, and basically on the same terms as the First Treaty of London. And it essentially, over the winter of 1361 and 1362, the territory agreed was transferred into English control. And at this point, we'll end our first part of the history of the 100 Years' War.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm very impressed by the specific dates in that. A lot of these bits of history we do in these podcasts, the dates aren't so specific for, probably aren't known in a lot of the cases. So.
Well, with the medieval sources, the history becomes a bit more precise.
Just one thing, you mentioned the English tactic there or strategy of the chevauchée, and the sort of brutal raiding on a massive scale across France. It reminded me of there's a quote attributed to Henry V. Of course, it's a bit later, but the English carried on using the tactic. Which I think he must have been questioned about, the propriety, or whether the brutality was of the chevauchés, especially the burning of villages. And he's supposed to have said something effective that war without fire is like sausage without mustard. So it's what you do.
Yeah, I think, as I say, the chevauchée was brutal even by the standards of medieval warfare. The English are accused of raping nuns. I think the king himself actually forbade that, but I think he couldn't actually control the troops. And certainly they stripped abbeys of their wealth and other things, which wouldn't make you exactly popular with the papacy as well. But we'll come up onto the papacy in our second part of the history.
And again, just sort of thinking sort of forward in time, I know Henry VIII, Henry V, published quite strict ordinances for his army, which to try and mitigate some of that. And I think didn't Henry V end up hanging a soldier who had stolen something from a church?
I think you may well be correct in that. Yes.
Yeah, but I think he was just taking the edge off what, as you say, is a pretty brutal and horrible way to wage war. Not that war's nice at the best of times. Anyway, thank you, Richard. Thank you for that. It's a set up with two of the very famous battles from the 100 Years' War, and of course, it's maybe nationalistic there. We end on a high note for the English. Of course, with full hindsight, we know it doesn't carry on quite that well the rest of the war.
It's a bit like the English cricket team. We always overreach.
Yes. So Is the English chevauchée the equivalent of the current English cricket team baseball approach? Discuss.
Sorry,
And I'm
couldn't
sure if
resist
we've
that one.
got any Australian MEG players who listen to us, I'm sure they'll express so, something quite in a usual forthright manner about that. Anyway, at the time we speak, there the Australians are 2-0 up in the Ashes, and God knows what's going to happen in the third one. Sorry, she's just underway. Anyway, moving on. Let's move on. Stick with Meg rather than cricket for a change, and we'll move on to some army lists. So I think we would start with Matt, who has, I believe, produced us a couple of 100 Years' War French that fit into the time period Richard has just been discussing. Maybe even inspired by those two big battles. So I think we'll pass it over to you, Matt, and you can unleash your lists upon us. I don't know if you want to make any comments about the actual 100 Years' War French list in MEG, or just dive straight into your lists. Over to you anyway.
Right. Well, yeah. The quick rundown of the 100 Years' War French list. It's pretty much what you'd expect. It's a lot of knights, which are either mounted or dismounted, depending on the date period you're in. They've got some supporting lesser armed cavalry in the valet de guerre, servants of war. Is that what that translates as?
Essentially, I think so. Yeah, roughly.
Yeah. And then it's a mob of crossbowmen, an assortment of average foot to really quite horrible foot, armed with spears and short spears and pole arms and stuff that the French aren't that interested in at this period. The list also includes from 1418 a Scottish contingent. This post-dates the lists I've done. I've kept it within Richard's time frame, so which adds some power bow into the mix and some Scottish men at arms. It's a different flavour. I definitely think it would add to a list, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself on that one. So I've done one for 1346, which is Cressy. I'm not going to say I'm inspired by the battle when I wrote this list, but it possibly might have influenced my thinking. Which you start with I'm starting with a mediocre, instinctive King of France as your army commander.
Yeah. Well, Richard said he lost control of his army, so.
Well, yeah, I'm almost tempted to ask, could I have all allied generals? Because it just kind of would fit the feel even better. Save me some points as well, actually, thinking about it. Anyway, sorry. And then I've got 3 competent, instinctive sub-generals. Like, I figured nobody shone on the day, so they can all be the same. And 4 mediocres was just too low on the command cards for me. So it's three competence and a mediocre, giving you 11, which probably is still not enough, but might give you a good feel of how the army doesn't handle. Anyway, so that gives you a stonking PBS of 4 and a scouting of 2, because there's almost no light cavalry or protected cavalry, and your skirmishers are limited to some crossbowmen and some bidets. So the list itself, you have French knights, who are cavalry formed loose, superior, fully armored, charging lancer, dev charger. They have an option for melee expert, which I've taken, which has given me 4 tugs, 2 of 6, 2 of 4. So around 20 French superior knights. I think that kind of justifiably covers the Cressy mounted wing.
Feels very French.
Yeah. And I have to say, I do like heavy metal, but anybody who's seen my cataphract lists knows that all my Venetians in the 100 years in the Italian wars. But anyway, so and then the rest of the army, which is a further 5 tugs, is basically missile troops. Now I've gone with 2 blocks of French crossbowmen, who are infantry formed loose, average protected, experienced crossbow, 2 blocks of 8. I've then taken the Genoese crossbowmen, or mercenary crossbowmen, depending on your desires, are infantry drilled loose, average protected, experienced crossbow, shoot and cover, shield, cover and shoot, which basically allows them to shoot and retain the shield cover. Handy little trick when facing power bow, I think. Well, any skill bows probably it's the power bow's not the issue, it's the skill bow more. But anyway, and then a final French longbowman, which are formed loose, average, protected, experienced power bow 6. So that's 3 missile troops in 6, 2 of 8s. And then there's 2 blocks of skirmishers, which are the previously mentioned B-Days and skirmishing crossbowmen. B-Days are skirmishers, poor, unprotected, experienced javelin, combat shy, 6. Skirmishing crossbowmen are infantry skirmisher, poor, unprotected, experienced crossbow, combat shy, another 6. They're both poor because I'd preferred average, but I just couldn't get them into the points range without playing around with the tugs, which wasn't where I wanted to be headed. That's essentially it. Command and control is probably a bit of a nightmare. I'm figuring you work all the crossbowmen together in a big, all the missile troops in a big block. Use the 2 skirmishing blocks to actually form holes in those lines. So it's 2 tugs, a sug, 2 tugs, a sug, and then a tug on the end. And behind those sugs of missile troops, you position the 2 blocks of 4 French knights. Gives you a bit of protection for the French missile troops, and do something really unsubtle like march straight up the table and shoot at a lot of people, and anybody who gets too keen, unleash 20 units of superior knight, 20 bases of superior knights on them, and see what mess you can make. And there were a lot of rough going troops there, so I mean, if you want to counter the French knights and put down rough, you've still got to fight your way. Sorry, what I should have said was I've made none of the missile troops combat shy, so they're all protected, and that's it. They've got no negatives in combat unless you catch them in the open when mounted, but then you're firing into the face of crossbowmen, so swings and roundabouts. I have a great deal of respect for crossbowmen that aren't combat shy. The damn things can hold up some pretty good quality troops for a very long time, and whilst you're slowly cutting your way through the foot, you've then got a lot of knights to worry about. So there you go. Anyway, that's the list.
Yeah. Straightforward. Yeah, and just on those crossbowmen, of course, if they're sitting there and charged, they get the wound on S. So, anything charging them is more vulnerable in that final charge. So, yeah. I can honestly say I do not think I've ever seen an army with a PBS of 4 before.
No, I was quite impressed by that myself, I have to admit.
So, yes. In some ways, I was surprised it got a scouting of 2.
I had to struggle for that. I had to take those 2 units of skirmishers.
Oh, right. That's why the 2. So, yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does what it says on the tin, doesn't it? It ain't big, it ain't subtle. Oddly, I'm not sure it's undercommanded because it's quite straightforward.
Yeah.
I've used a sort of missile and knightsy-ish thing in my Edward IV Army with 11 cards before. It seems to work. In fact, I've used 11 card armies a few times recently, and I think I'm sort of coming around to the idea that they're not bad really, as long as you have had a bit of a think about it beforehand and basically don't try and be too clever everywhere.
It'd be very hard for me to try and dance with this army. I'll probably give it a go, but no, it really is a line them up and thump somebody or shoot them a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you've got the 2 Genoese are drilled, so they could potentially do something a bit clever in the right situation. But apart from that, not a lot of cleverness there. But those French knights have got a big punch, and they're entirely superior, fully armored. No, none of the protected second rank that you get in things like the Crusader armies. So there's no, I've lost the base out the front rank. Oh, you're into something squishy. You're just into more of the good stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's not my sort of army, but I could see it being quite scary in the right circumstances. Richard. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I was going to ask Richard what he thought.
Yeah,
he's not convinced, is he, Matt?
I'm not convinced it's an army I would wish to use, but it's, I mean, these superior knights are a force to be reckoned with. It has to be said. And you could lose control and run down your own crossbowmen, which would be a very French thing to do with those knights. Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I tended to go more a Poitiers sort of 100 Years' War French army than this
Funny you should say that.
sort of Cressy one. So, yeah, maybe we'll take a look at that instead.
Yeah. Before we do that, can I just pick up a couple of things, sort of list things, really. One is the fact that the French list at this date has got some longbowmen, which I'm mildly surprised about, but I wouldn't ever claim to be an expert on medieval French armies.
I don't know whether there ought to be a date restriction in there.
Obviously, they come in later when you get to certainly the Ordnance French, and maybe the late, but yeah, just made me go, oh, quite frankly, I didn't even know they were in the list. So
I don't know
they
the
certainly
period.
occur later on in the 100 Years' War.
Mm.
The French start adopting. They may have used some Low Countries longbowmen even in the early stage of the war. That would be the source, I suspect, of any French longbowmen at that time. But I must admit, I would have to do more research, to be honest.
Yeah, no, it was just a bit of a surprise, really, rather than anything. It could be perfect. The other one was Matt's almost throwaway comment about the French losing control of the army, whether internal Allied generals perhaps be a thing.
Their allies are generally, if you've got a reliability issue, perhaps. I think basically, if you joined the King of France in a French army, then you would certainly be a reliable. Maybe it's a scenario thing rather than
sorry, I was going to say the other option is maybe for this period, all commanders must command knights. Don't make them allied generals, but they must command knights. I don't know how structured their forces were, because then that does give you the command and control issues. Because that list that I've designed there, I would expect two of the competent commanders to be commanding just the foot and not the knights, or maybe
Yeah, I think the 100 Years' War armies, I think, are difficult to represent in lists. This is something I was going to come on to when discussing my army, but maybe we discuss it now. And the whole command structure of battles in medieval armies isn't always well represented in the lists. Maybe this is an example. I think it would become a very difficult army to use in competition if you had to take allies, but certainly for scenario games, there's lots of opportunities for tweaking about with command structures.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tension, isn't there? The lists are designed for these equal points, pick up competition type games, so you want to keep them reasonably usable. I'm sure lots of people out there will say, what about such and such an army? I think it's unusable. Well, that's often a matter of opinion. or indeed player skill, dare we say.
Well, to be fair, I think I've hampered it enough. It probably doesn't need allied generals to make it any
Come pre-hampered.
Yes.
Okie dokie. Matt, you you have a second one of these that you have just hinted might be a bit later.
Yes.
Have some differences.
Not grossly that different, but yes, this is the Poitiers version. So Sydney or
So
otherwise.
this is,
I'm not,
in list
sorry.
terms, this is sort of the army after the shock of Cressy, isn't it? When
Yes.
when Richard said 1,500 lords and knights are killed, which is an astonishing number, quite frankly. And it would undoubtedly be a shock. So that the French did change their ways a little. So I'll let you go through your army and maybe explain how this demonstrates they changed their ways.
Well, they may have changed their ways. I'm not sure I changed my list structure too much. But anyway, this list probably represents what Richard described as the last battle of the, as in the last phase of Poitiers. So it's 1356. The command structure is pretty similar. This time I've upgraded King John to be competent instinctive. So it's 4 competent instinctive generals. Surprisingly, in doing that, he now has a PBS of 5. I'm moving up in the world, but the scouting has dropped to 1. So
the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away.
Absolutely, he's really blundered straight in. Well, actually, the English blundered into him, but obviously that day of rest on the Sunday is just mucked up his scouting. So right, so what has stayed the same? Well, I've kept all the French crossbowmen and all the Genoese crossbowmen. So you've got the 2 blocks of 8 French crossbowmen and the 2 blocks of 6 Genoese crossbowmen. So that's four tugs. You've still got a single block of mounted French knights, a block of 4. So they're the formed loose, superior, fully armored, charging lancers, dev chargers, melee expert. All the other mounted and the French longbowmen have gone, and they've been replaced with 4 tugs of dismounted French knights, of which you have 2 blocks of 8 who are formed close, average, fully armored, 2-handed cut and crush, dismountable, melee expert. So pretty much full fat, short of being superior. So they've got all the bells and whistles. You've then got 2 blocks of 6, but they lose melee expert. Now, the thinking behind that is they operate with a crossbowman, so they're probably going to be deep. I'm not that worried about them having melee expert. They're just there to countercharge or basically stop people contacting the crossbowman. So it's not a list I'm overly keen on, having written it. I have to admit, I prefer the mounted version, because this one really does. You stick it on the table and you're going forward, and you really don't have much in the way of altering your plans. So all in all, it's 9 tugs, so it breaks on 5. 4 lots of dismounted knights, 1 mounted reserve of 4 French knights, 2 blocks of crossbowmen, 2 blocks of Genoese crossbowmen. Oh, and the B-Day skirmishers, which gives you 10 for deployment in total. There you have it. Nightmare to fight frontally. I'd worry about its flanks.
Yes. Even more than the last one, as you say. Yes. I do like the 2 8s. 8s are dismounted.
Oh, I've used them.
They could be pretty terrifying, quite frankly.
Oh, they are just so difficult. They grind through everything. I've seen, I think it was Ray's stood up against exceptional Roman legionaries, totally out of period, obviously, but and just stood there. Just because I think they were on even factors, crazily enough, because of the fully armored.
Yeah,
was that a Free Company army he was using?
I think so. Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, I think they I think are even superior, aren't they?
Yes, I think they can be actually. Now
so,
you said it.
I mean, I think they're even tougher, but
don't think the superior ones can have melee expert.
No, I'd hope
which
not.
Would just be absolutely horrific. Yeah, you can have some that are superior but not melee experts. So they're better in the impact phase, but the same in.
Yeah, so exceptional legionaries would be on a 3, 2 for exceptional.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be horrendously expensive though as well.
Well,
Yes, yeah.
well,
A mere 193 points each.
yeah. Well, true. You know, these dismounted French knights are, bargain, 167.
Yeah.
I think you forgot to mention, actually, Matt, they're all dismountable.
Oh, sorry. Did I not? Yes,
I
they're all
think,
dismantables. Yeah.
yeah,
Which I
I'm
believe
not.
is mandatory.
I'm not
Yes.
convinced dismountable is actually worth it, but
It is mandatory, though.
oh, it is, however, mandatory. So
Yes.
so
Yeah.
you've
Yeah.
got
I
to
have no
take it.
choice. Though I do wonder if there would ever be a game where doubling what 16 24 fully armored foot 10 inches up the table in the first turn scare the hell out of somebody.
It could,
Probably
yes.
the player commanding them, I would imagine.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
I have a horrible feeling, Matt, that those French knights, the actual mounted ones, should have dismountable as well.
I thought it was. Oh, you are quite right. Yes, they should. Yeah, well, there you go.
I should point out, listeners, that just before we started recording this, an army I'll be presenting later, Matt had spotted a much bigger error in my list than that. So perhaps that's me getting my own back a little.
Well,
I'm sure you could play around to get to sort it out, though. So it's
the B days go to unskilled, I think, and
it's
probably
be something like that, 'cause you only got 4. But yeah, it's again. Now I have to say it's not an army I'd be terribly excited about using. But I suspect both of these French ones would fit very well in a quite tightly themed competition, a 100 Years War themed competition.
yeah,
Because you're taking out lots of dancey type stuff, Eastern European or even further east. So the flanks maybe not quite as vulnerable, or you're at least everybody be wanting to fight over similar terrain, perhaps.
yeah. It certainly it doesn't inspire me as an army I want to rush out and paint. Well, actually, that's not true. The early one with all the mounted does inspire me to want to paint it. Use it not so much. Paint it, yes. But,
Oh, yeah. You want to get to town on heraldry, do you?
yeah, yes, I tend to have that habit of, oh, I'll just do all the individual heraldry. I still have nightmares about my early Burgundian when I did all the heraldry for that. And yeah, let's not go there. Still a therapy session in the making, that one. But no,
Okay,
no.
I'm going to ask a question based on, again, a comment you made with your first list. You noted that the 100 Years' War French list for the later part of the war, which is actually 1418 to 1429, can have a Scottish contingent, which you didn't take because you wanted to theme these two armies around Crécy and Poitiers. Do you think that Scottish contingent makes the 100 Years' War a better or at least more interesting army if you took it?
I have a feeling the drilled close Scottish men at arms, 8 of those, it just gives you a slightly bit more maneuverability. The ability to, for example, turn left or right and still double move, because you're doing it on a green, and the power bow, which again gives you a bit more flank protection from mounted. I mean, not saying that crossbowmen are bad for it, but the extra inch, the extra base width on power bow, and the +1 for fighting mounted makes whatever flank they're on just untenable for mounted unless they're feeling really, really brave. And that doesn't always end well.
Yeah.
So I just feel it's a bit more flexible. It adds. I don't think what you're taking out of the army to put them in are no great loss because they're same for same. So they're men at arms for men at arms dismounted. You probably lose. I'd almost be. You lose one block of the French and one block of the Genoese would probably allow you the power bow. I haven't quite worked the points out for that. But,
Yeah, no, so
Yeah.
it's going to be broadly similar, isn't it?
Yeah. So you get it that way. So yeah, I think it adds. Not that I've played around with it that much. That would probably make me happier about taking it to a competition, even especially in a narrower theme.
Yeah. Yeah. Richard, any?
Yeah, I mean the 100 Years' War French this army is what I would sort of expect, I think. I have tried playing with it in the past. I probably had fewer missile men, and I've tended to come unstuck with it. It's the flanks are always a bit of a worry. But yeah, it is what it is. And as we've said, the dismounted knights are quite fearsome. Fully armored, two-handed cut and crush from melee expert is a powerful combination once you get past the initial impact phase.
Yeah, the impact phase can be a problem against good charging cavalry.
Yep.
But
or you can get lucky and the charging lancers don't do their thing, as I was fortunate enough to experience earlier this year in the Magna competition.
Yeah, if they don't, if you can limit the number of bases that are contacted, and they don't roll something to get the shatter, then with the fully armored, two-handed cut and crush and melee expert, that's 4 claims. And if you're fighting somebody that's got fully armored, well, that doesn't count against two-handed cut and crush. So the opponent loses that claim. So yeah, the melee phase can be very, very nasty.
Yeah, sadly, my opponent ran down one of my longbowmen who managed the double blank on the shooting in the same battle.
Yeah.
So swings and roundabouts.
Yeah, as I'm sure we might comment on with the English armies, the longbowmen. Yeah, that thing Matt mentioned about they can be quite a good flank guard. The extended range and the plus for shooting at mounted doesn't always work, and I think if the opponent can again get some good charging or decent charging cavalry and approach them intelligently, the bowman may only get one shot off. It can be horrible, but if it isn't in the open, longbowman could be in trouble, which is historical. Anyway, I think we've possibly gone through as much on Matt's lists as we're going to. So thank you very much for doing those, Matt, and thank you for doing sort of themed ones for those 2 first major battles of the 100 Years' War that Richard covered. And I think that means we move on to Richard, who has a roughly contemporary English army.
Yeah,
give to us.
Which I've had to revise to make legal. So I'm not immune to it either. And I'm still not sure if it's entirely legal.
I've had my thunder stolen.
Anyway,
so when we put these up, we'll leave it there for a quiz for the listeners to go and examine and see if they can spot the potential illegality.
So the revised list I've got is actually contains 4 professional commanders, 3 competent and 1 mediocre, and has a PBS of 7 and a scouting of 2 as a result. It consists of a unit of 6 English knights, cavalry form loose, average, fully armoured, charging lancer, devastating chargers. No melee expert, but if you've got the command, charge them in and then pull them out to charge again. It's always an option. So I'm not overly worried about the lack of melee expert, unless I'm fighting other knights that do have melee expert. Along with that, I have 2 sixes of retinue longbowmen with front rank men at arms. So 3 of them have the melee expert, and these are drilled loose, average protected, skilled power bow. Along with that, I have 2 sixes of just ordinary longbowmen, again with men at arms, so the average protected, experienced power bow, and the half of them with the melee expert. These are formed loose. Along with that, I've gone heavily on the men at arms. So I have 3 sixes of men at arms. 2 are English, 1 is Gascon. So they're the drilled, formed in the case of the Gascons, average protected, 200 cut and crush melee experts. A unit of Gascon Knights who are tribal loose, superior, fully armoured, charging lancers and devastating chargers, point and shoot. A unit of 8 crossbowmen, form loose, average protected, experienced crossbow. Quite good in my experience on holding a hill or something like that on the flank. And a unit of brigands who are tribal loose, average protected, polearm, just a 6, and just to top it off, a unit of skirmishing B-days, 4 unprotected, experienced javelin combat shy, mainly to fill up the other 102 points. So yeah, 12 units, 11 tugs. And I think that could probably take on quite a lot of things. You need to use the men-at-arms and longbowmen in combination, in my experience. Otherwise, the longbowmen can risk getting run down. And the knights can play around the flanks or reserve. Yeah, I think I'd be quite happy to take that against most things, I think. By the way, it's supposed to represent a army setting off from Guyenne.
Hence the Gascons, presumably.
Hence the Gascons.
Okay, so this, so a bit like the Black Prince's army.
Yeah.
Right. I quite like this one. It appeals to me more than the French do, the French armies. Yes. The ability to have those the units of men at arms protected is an interesting option, because obviously quite a lot cheaper, but you are giving up a claim against a lot of things.
Indeed, but yeah, I mean they'll still, as I say, I use them in combination with the longbowmen. So hopefully you can get a bit of shooting on whatever you're facing up front first. I've deployed them 2 wide between the longbow units, and then you've got a bit of depth to the unit, even though there are 6s, and you've got the longbowmen who are also melee expert alongside potentially. So it's a combination. Gives people pause for thought, I think.
Yeah, no, it's no problem with that. I'd have been tempted to give dismountable to those English knights. That you'd probably end up downgrading the B-days to unskilled javelin, I suspect, to fit it in.
It's okay. He can save the points by legalizing the Gascon Knights. You can only have 4. You can only have 4.
Oh,
okay. Oops, I said I wasn't sure it was still legal. Okay, well, yeah, indeed.
My experience is with these sort of things. You either get them right first time, or you get 3 or 4 iterations as you correct errors, put new ones in.
As I'm the most guilty of it, I can hardly throw stones around here, but
we all do it. Everybody does it. Sometimes it's just you just miss the most obvious things. But yeah, no, I just think because if you dismount those English knights, you would be able to have one unit that's fully armored, although it doesn't have melee experts. So again, swings and roundabouts, but could be useful as a shooting resistant unit at some point. But I don't think it's a biggie by any stretch of the imagination. Yeah, I just think this one's got more flexibility, I think, hasn't it? And those almost compulsory 2 units of skilled power bow, they can really hurt people. The rate, that 5 base width range for the power bow, and you're skilled, is really, really good.
Yep.
So, yeah, some silence there. You can't argue with that statement. I was fairly comfortable that statement was a fact.
I think I would agree with that.
Yeah. I have to say, from a rules point of view, I'm not entirely sure it's justified having the extra range, but it's where we are. It's there, so use it. It is, yeah. But as I was saying just before we started this, I think a well-timed mounted attack on the longbowmen, if they have to fight in the open, can take them out. But of course, that is where you're combining the men-at-arms units with the longbowmen units is there to protect them, just like the English did.
Yep.
So
that's the idea.
It's damn, yes. Shall we say historical tactics work?
Oh, don't go that far.
Matt, sorry, I think I've been talking a lot again.
I find the 100 Years' War English armies one of the toughest to face in any competition. If they have a synergy about them, particularly with the men at arms being able to go through the bow. Makes it very hard to get a good attack on. There is always a counter, and it's very. I'm not saying it's wrong. I mean, they do suffer sometimes. I think that it's very hard for them to push an attack depending on what they're facing. So they don't always get into the top tier. But I think we'll come on to a list that did manage top tier.
Well, I was going to lead into this one by asking Richard. I mean, obviously, again, he's gone. I'm basically picking a Poitiers type army coming from Guyenne. But I was going to note, I think you just hinted at it there, Matt, that last year at BritCon, over our 5-round competition, Dr. Simon Elliott won the whole competition using an early 100 Years' War English, of which the English part was just 4 units of longbowmen, 2 with the skilled power bow and 2 without. And then a feudal German ally and a Low Countries ally. I suppose one of the questions I would ask off the back of that is, why did it do so well? Because I must admit, I remember list checking that and thinking, okay, interesting, but not great. Actually, I've often found when I do that, the army then does well. So maybe that tells you something about my judgment on armies.
I think you'll find I was the only person to fight it who didn't lose.
Quite possibly, Richard. Yeah.
I'm the wrong person to ask.
So what were you using? What did you beat it with? That's probably the more telling.
I was using Tang Chinese.
Yeah, I'd put odds on that coming out of it. Yeah. That's probably the counter that you'd want, particularly in your hands, because the number of times you've handed me my head against your Tang. Yeah.
Yeah, because you don't actually. Actually, one question to go ask is those, not just because Simon Elliott's army did very well. You can't do better than winning the competition, but just your thoughts on those allies, either one or using them together, and having faced it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I thought Simon's army was okay. I'm not convinced the combination of both allies gives you anything that you particularly spectacular, but I think it's another option to explore, frankly, when you're looking at early 100 Years' War English. I personally, I wouldn't take it with the Allies, but clearly Simon's result shows that you can do well with.
Well, this is it. You can't argue with that, Matt. Yeah, I think I sent you the list earlier. Hopefully, you've had a look at it. What was your thoughts on it?
I can see why it did well. I can also see why it didn't do so well again. I think what I like about it is you get 18 fully armored knights, which you can't do in the vanilla 100 Years War list.
Right. Yes.
And I think it's those 18, well, one of which is superior. So you've got a block of 6 superior in there as well. It's a different take. It's more offensive than it is defensive. I don't know how Simon used it, but I would expect him to be quite aggressive, rough terrain.
I think he always says whatever he uses, isn't he?
To be fair, yes. Every time I fought Simon, he's usually over the table edge before I got halfway over the line before I even blink. But no, the combination of skilled and all those knights. It's an interesting. Yeah, as I say, I can see why he did well. I'm not sure I could do well with it, quite frankly, because it requires far too much micromanagement, I think, to get yourself in the right place at the right time. I also noticed he's only got 11 cards, which is interesting for an aggressive stance, but obviously made it work.
Yep, this is it. I mean, so, if I remember, a lot of his aggressive stuff was driven by 2 allies who were talented. I think the English was a competent CNC, so I suspect he just block moved them.
And he's got 36 bases of missile troops.
Yeah.
Plus guns, unskilled, poor guns, bless them.
I think the Low Country has to have them.
And it makes him 12 for deployment as well, so that's quite.
Yeah. No, it was interesting. It was interesting because it was definitely different. Because I think the possibly comment shortly. The usual 100 Years War is a later 100 Years War with a Burgundian ally. So although it's 100 Years War, it's a different one. Anyway, talking of later 100 Years War English, shall we move on to one of those, since I've knocked one up? Obviously, this is moving outside of the history Richard covered, but as I said, we're covering the sort of the French and the English in this podcast, so only seemed right to include a couple of later armies. So I'm going to do later 100 Years War English, and I'll follow this up with a French from the later war as well. So the later 100 Years War English list, lots of similarities with the earlier one. However, it has fewer men-at-arms available. For various reasons, some societal, some financial. The English armies of the time were moving to have a higher proportion of bowmen compared to men-at-arms. And that's reflected in the list. I said they can have a Burgundian ally from 1422 to 1431. Richard, no doubt, will cover the history next time, which will explain that. But I've not gone with that for this list. I thought in the spirit of the big battle, the big headline battles, I'll go for Agincourt. Could have gone for later ones, and so being English, we tend to ignore the very late ones because we lost. But I could have gone for, say, Verneuil. But I thought we'll go Agincourt right at the beginning of the list, 1415, Henry V. So the list I've come up for this one, I've just gone for 3 generals. I've gone for a legendary professional CNC and 2 competent professional sub-generals. Legendary, we'll buy into the Henry V myth. And he's certainly very inspiring, and he's certainly very successful, so we can do that. But part of the thinking as well was this army is going to have a lot of loose formation troops in it, fewer men at arms, more longbowmen. So I want to have a lot more control over the terrain. I thought I want to have that that factor, really, to be able to dictate it compared to my enemy. And it's left me with a PBS of 9 because of that. The army itself, I've got a 6-base unit of English Knights, formed loose, average, fully armoured, charging lancer, devastating charges, dismountable. Dismountable is partly because it does give me a possibility of another unit of fully armoured foot if I want it. The 2 skilled power bow units, the same as Richard's. So each of 6 bases, half of them have melee expert. An average formed loose experienced power bow version of those. So again, half men at arms, half not. Then I've gone for 2 6s of just longbowmen, formed loose, average protected, experienced power bow. And then 2 more units of longbowmen, again of 6, the same, but they're unprotected. You can downgrade some of the longbowmen to longbowmen without armor. So they're average, unprotected, experienced power bow. All those longbowmen I've given stakes to. Partly because that's what was done in the Agincourt campaign. I have mixed feelings about using stakes, but if you do use them, you've got to use them all. So I went, so there we are. I've given them all stakes. I've got a 6-base unit of men-at-arms on foot, drilled close, average, fully armoured, 2-handed cut and crush and melee expert, and a unit of Welsh spearmen. I've got it's a bit in my memory that there was some with the campaign. These are infantry, tribal loose, average, unprotected, short spear, melee expert, fleet of foot, and they're an 8-base unit. 2 units of skirmishers, Irish Kerns and Breton javelinmen, infantry skirmisher, average, unprotected, experienced javelin, combat shy, both 6s. And by having those 12 bases, that tipped me over to a scouting of 3 as well. So the combination of the skirmishers, the knights, and the legendary general, that's a pretty high scouting for these sort of armies, in my view. So there we are. So this is a big shooty army, big foot shooty army. We've got 7 units, each of 6 bases of longbowmen, of which 2 of those units are skilled. They do all have stakes, so if they're out in the open against mounted, the stakes can go down. And obviously the drilled ones are better at putting the stakes down than the formed ones. And you can, if I remember, I got my rules right, do a double move, and deploy your stakes with the drilled.
You can indeed.
Useful, especially as you can shoot from 5 base widths away. Obviously the experienced, the formed loose ones can't do that. So you have decisions to make there. I've got the 2 units of unprotected longbowmen, who I think would be likely to I'd want to use them as supports for the other ones. Try not to get them shot at by, if you become a French army, it's got lots of shooters. You'd hope to take the shooting with something with more armor and use those to add extra shooting. But again, the power bow, so they can shoot from that further distance and may be able to shoot without being shot back at. And this is an absolute bonus. This army came in at exactly 10,000 points, assuming it's legal. And as this podcast, we're not having a great rate of legal lists at the moment. So somebody may come and go, oh, hang on. That isn't. So, in terms of maneuverability, obviously the retinue longbowmen who are drilled are pretty nippy. The cavalry are as well. And oddly, because I have used these in an army or something similar, the Welsh spearmen, although they're tribal loose, they're fleet of foot and can occasionally just insert themselves from 4 base widths away into some really annoying position for the enemy. Ideally, a flank, of course. So anyway, that was my sort of Agincourt campaign, later 100 Years' War English. I will throw it open to the floor.
I'd be spitting teeth if I brought one of my mounted armies and then you actually brought stakes with a 100 Years' War English army. I'd just give up at that point and be like, really? Nobody brings stakes in a 100 Years' War English army.
I have to say, having fitted them in with a PBS of 9 and scouting of 3, I might be changing my mind on stakes.
Yeah, no, well, you hit the 10,000 points exactly. You've got a legendary general. You've got 3 scouting in the 100 Years' War English Army, which pretty much unheard of. So what's not to love? And frankly, I mean, I bang on about it every time, but having been out-scouted by a 2-card 100 Years' War Army with early Lithuanians, which, by the way, had a PBS of 9 and a scouting of 7. Not that I'm bitter. Not that I'm bitter. That was the competition where they got out-scouted by everybody. I didn't out-scout anybody in the entire competition. That it was early Lithuania. You just sit there and go, if I can't, and that's when I revised my scouting method. I thought, well, sod it, I don't care what the scouting is anymore. It's all in the cards. But I digress. Sorry. No, I really like that, Nick. And the Welsh Spearmen are a must as far as I'm concerned. They're just one of those units people go, no, whatever. They're filler. And then, as you say, you suddenly insert them somewhere, and they go, oh, that's just annoyed me. So really good.
Yeah.
No, I can't fault that at all. Yeah. I mean, I thought you'd overdone it with a legendary professional general, but the more I look at it, the more I think, actually, you know what? No, that really does work quite well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things I thought about that. Although I like those Welsh Spearmen, if you dropped them, you could have another you could have a mediocre professional general added into that to have 13 cards.
Do you care though? I mean,
no, I probably wouldn't. But if you were that way inclined, and you could certainly get that general, I suspect, if you dropped all the stakes. But I think that.
Oh yeah, they're 10 points each, aren't they?
Yeah.
10 points. Or it's 10 points. Yeah, they're 10 points each.
It's 10 points each. You're talking 60 points per unit. But obviously, I was going with the Agincourt thing, and as I said, balance of the army. I might be changing my mind on stakes. I might have to go and buy some models, having sold my old ones. When I sold my previous incarnation of my Edward IV army.
I spent a very long time with wooden toothpicks and just cutting and sharpening and sticking them into bases. So they work quite well.
Yeah.
Hello,
Richard.
Yeah.
He starts off a year again.
I want a foot army, preferably one with lots of devastating chargers, who can and flexible, I suspect.
Yeah, I wouldn't like to use this to face against, say, a Catalan company in Anatolia. Superior Almogavars.
Aren't they the unprotected ones?
They are.
Yeah, that's your saving grace. But
I think I'd worry more about the ones in Greece who are protected.
I've used the unprotected ones to run over all the longbowmen in an army Robin used. Again, because of the fleet of foot, if you play it cannily, they'll only shoot you once.
Yeah.
And then you hit them on red dice.
I think if it was an open competition and somebody turned up with early Imperial Roman, they'd probably upset your day and all.
Oh yeah. There's something of this one, possibly a bit like the other ones. It's really with an eye to theme. You'd use one of the other options, say with the Burgundian ally, in a more open competition. There's reasons it's popular.
Oh yeah. Totally.
Sorry, Richard, you were saying.
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a bit. It's inevitably a bit one-dimensional, particularly when you take the stakes. You're fearsome against mounted and vulnerable if you get a big foot army. If you want to be accurate for Agincourt, you probably need a lot of the troops downgraded in quality because of the illness that was throughout the English army at the time, and you want to stick them behind some rough or boggy, even difficult going. You might even regard the muddy fields as marsh, and then have an opponent who charges straight at you. This is always very difficult to sort out in the rules.
Yep. Yeah, getting a cooperative opponent is often the trickiest part.
Yes, it would take a brave person to downgrade their quality from average to poor. You get a big army, which again wouldn't be terribly historical. But, you get an awful lot. That would be scary again for mounted armies. Poor, downgrade all the longbowmen to poor, and then have them behind stakes with even more power bow.
You could effectively probably say all those longbowman units in this army become 8s. I don't think the list allows you, but
No,
it'd be about that. Yeah, that would be behind stakes. Oh, we're poor. Ho ho ho.
Well, I think you've got all bar 12 of the longbowmen allowed in the list anyway, haven't you?
It's close.
Yeah, but that's another tug or two.
Yeah.
You could bulk it out. You possibly would want another general in that. Well, although of course your scenario has a cooperative opponent, so you wouldn't actually have to manoeuvre.
Indeed.
Who brings all mounted as well, just icing on
Oh, well, you see, that's the thing. Remember, Agincourt, most of the French were still on foot.
All right.
There were
So
two attacks on
what
the
you're
wing.
relying on is me charging my mounted through my foot to get to your longbowman. Is what
Always helps.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, as I say, fully armoured foot advancing through a marsh against longbowmen, probably
Yeah,
not
I think
happy scenario.
Agincourt, that sort of harks back to the last two podcasts we did about specific historical battle refights, isn't it? You'd have to really set that up very much as that. You're not going to get anything like that in a equal points competition-y type game.
Maybe fully armoured should count Marsh's Swamp.
Ooh.
Cab test every turn you move. Ooh.
Oh dear.
And you're only moving 2.
Yeah. And for some reason you are forced to advance. It just gets worse, doesn't it? You know?
Yeah. Well, you either stand there whilst you get peppered by longbow arrows and hope they eventually run out of them, or you try and kill yourself by advancing.
Yes, so advance your army and see if it can actually die before it gets into contact through accumulated shooting and cabs for moving through a swamp. That'd be quite something to see.
That'd bring tears of frustration to you, and that's
Yeah.
probably how it felt at Agincourt. Yeah,
Possibly best as some sort of pre-programmed solo game. Because I don't think it would be fun to be moving the French in that situation.
Well, not the way I throw dice, particularly when it's my casualties. Yeah.
Okie dokie. So that one, yeah, I think it's a very specific army, isn't it? It's very much a working theme, bit ropey outside, but it was nice to get to exactly 10,000 points. Okay, on to the last list for this podcast, probably. As I said, I'd do another French one. This is for right at the end of the war, really. So I'm going for French ordnance. The French finally got that together. They reformed their army and kicked the English out of France because of it. That was one of the reasons, anyway. So I thought I'd do an army for right at the end of the war from the French ordnance list. The French ordnance list is definitely turning into what it's getting close to the armies that started appearing in the Italian War supplement. There's a couple of these at the end of the Valois list. The cavalry pick up armored horse, and which I think it's not coincidental that by the end of the 100 Years' War and afterwards, cavalry made a significant reappearance on the battlefields of Europe. Cavalrymen started fighting mounted again a lot more than they had done in the 100 Years' War, where they'd jumped off their horses because of the English longbowmen, and that had become a very typical way of fighting. So you get French cavalry who are on armored horses, which really blunts even longbowmen shooting at them. The French also introduced quite a lot of their own longbowmen into the army. The every knight had to be accompanied by a valet and archers. So they wanted to fight fire with fire. So as well as their improved cavalry, they had archers who they hoped could shoot on equal terms with the English. And then they had a lot of the similar sort of troops they'd had before, but these more professional troops, like the ordnance companies, became the core of the army. So in some ways it's got some real differences from the earlier ones, but as you'll see from this list, you can come up with something that's actually quite similar, but will probably play in a different way. Anyway, enough of this. It's all another change actually is because it becomes a lot more professional, and the list reflects this by having professional generals instead of instinctive. So I've gone 4 generals, a competent CNC, a talented subbie, and 2 mediocre subbies, which left me with a PBS of 7. I've gone for 3 units of cavalry. These are half men-at-arms and half custilier. The 2 of the units are 4s and 1 unit is a 6. The ordnance men-at-arms part of it are drilled close, superior, armoured horse, fully armoured, charging lancer, devastating chargers, dismountable, melee expert. Ooh, 276 points a base, lovely. The second rank, the custiliers, are also drilled close. They're average. They're also fully armoured, but don't have the armoured horse. And they're devastating chargers, dismountable, melee expert. An interesting point in the list that if these troops dismount, they all dismount as fully armoured. That note is important because instead of having the fully armoured custiliers, which I've got in this list, you could have the second rank as valet de guerre, who would just be protected. So somewhat cheaper, but would still dismount as fully armoured if you dismounted them. So, which is a nice trick, but obviously they're less useful as a second rank when mounted. And because of that, I've gone for fully armoured custiliers for all of those. So it says a 6 base unit, 2 4 base units, front rank superior, second rank average. I've gone for 2 units of the ordnance archers, drilled loose, average protected, experienced power bow, an 8 and a 6. 2 units of crossbowmen, as the other French armies, formed loose, average protected, experienced crossbow, 2 6s. 2 units of spearmen. These were a bit of a, I need to bulk out the army a bit. Formed close, average protected, short spear, shield wall, an 8 and a 6. In all honesty, there was a bit of bulk and the old mobile terrain feature. Just bung up something for a while. The shield wall helps if they're charged by something that's got charging lancers or mounted melee expert, but I wouldn't expect them to be doing too much. Later on in the list, the French can have some better infantry, but not at this point. They get some Swiss pikemen. So that's 9 tugs. I've gone for 4 sugs, a unit of skirmishing crossbowmen, infantry skirmishers, poor unprotected, experienced crossbow combat shy, a 6. And then I've gone for the other thing that the French Ordnance Army went for. They got big into guns and cannons. It was a big thing. And as the English found out, I think, is it Castillon, where Talbot was somehow induced to charge a fortified French camp that was bristling with cannons. That ended badly and pretty much ended the 100 Years' War. The English were finally fully kicked out of France, and Talbot was killed.
You're giving away the ending.
Oh, I think I'm assuming people do know that. So anyway, I've got for a big chunk of artillery in this. The list can actually have 9 bases of artillery, of which 6 can actually be upgraded to full cannon size, but I haven't done that. Anyway, I've gone for 2 3s of guns, light artillery, average unprotected, experienced guns, barricades, combat shy. So 2 3s of those, and a 2 base unit of cannons, heavy artillery, average unprotected, experienced cannons, barricades, combat shy. Now, obviously, they'll have to go down first, but that's 8 bases of artillery behind barricades. Kept them all average. Actually, because of a quirk in the points, there's no point in downgrading light artillery anyway. It doesn't change the points, and you only get a very minor points reduction on the cannons. So,
yeah, that is intentional.
Absolutely. Otherwise, it would be a bit
An obvious thing to do. Yeah.
Yeah, and people did do it. So but because they're behind barricades, they're not blown up if a tug gets into them. They're still average. So they could even hang around, and all those nasty cabs and stuff that people get for charging guns and cannon. So there we are. I mean, one thing with this army, in a way, you're hoping to try and get people to force them in some way to get in front of the artillery at least, possibly even charge the artillery, because that can be pretty horrible for them. The ordnance men at arms and custiliers provide a mounted punch, and you've got 4 other units of infantry shooters. So there you are. I must admit, after coming up with it, I'm not entirely sure how I'd use it. Oh, it's got a scouting of 2, which is sort of average-ish for this sort of thing. Anyway, there we go. Stunned silence.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of artillery behind barricades. When I actually took the guns, admittedly it was a later French ordnance, I actually didn't bother with the barricades and actually used them quite aggressively moving forward, so that my opponent was sort of forced to come and get me, and that seemed to work quite well. Yeah, I mean the knights are super tough. I just don't think you've quite got enough punch, really. I think the later French ordnance with the better foot is better, be my own view. But,
I think I concur with that. You can add a Swiss ally, or you can have some internal Swiss and pikemen.
Indeed.
So,
which I used to effect and to win the Magna Championship. So.
Oh, right, there we are. Again, a winning army. As we said, Simon Elliott's, you can't argue with a winning army in many ways, can you? So, yeah, Matt.
Yeah, I've played around with this version of the French Ordnance quite a bit, and it's less than its whole. I find the power bow look nice, but they die. They're very hard to keep alive. If you want to use them aggressively, you just, as Richard said, you just not got enough punch. Yeah, it is what it is. I like the guns, but because they look pretty, quite frankly, and some people do their nut when you put down 8 guns. They just their brain stops working, which is always a good thing when your opponent has a moment.
Yeah, that helped me a great deal in the Magna event.
Yeah. Well, think about Richard's comment about not using the barricades with the guns. I suspect if you lost the barricades, you probably get a reasonable amount of points back, because the barricades are actually quite expensive. You might be able to do something with the infantry. You could give the archers stakes for a start, if you're worried about them being run over by a mountain.
Yeah,
and again,
the cannons have to have them. The guns would save you 32 points per gun. So,
and there's 6 of them.
Yeah. So,
yeah.
As a slight aside, I remember it coming up. Somebody was talking about French ordnance, and this list has reminded me, where you have superior front rank and average back rank, if you chose to downgrade your front rank to average, so your ordnance knights became average rather than save yourself some points, your back rank becomes poor.
Yeah.
I'm not sure everybody is aware of that one. It's you downgrade the entire tug. It's not, you can't just do the front rank. So I just thought I'd call it out as one of those random quirks that people might not be aware of.
I think that one came to light with the later 100 Years' War English, with the Burgundian ally. I think that I might be wrong, but because they have,
it could be, yeah.
They have. I think they've got or can have a split thing anyway. But yes, no, you're quite right. Yeah, so yeah, yes, I did wonder about that. I could downgrade the front rank to average. Oh, the second rank goes to poor. And And in fact, even having the average can be a problem, in that if you have a cab, you have to do it on the worst quality.
Yeah.
There is almost an argument for taking the Italian Ally rather than the Ordnance Knights, because they are all average, and it's pretty much the same. If you don't want superior, you can do it with the Ally.
Nick, with your French ordnance, did you consider using pikemen rather than spearmen? Because you're allowed them from 1466, aren't you? Oh, I
Yeah.
suppose you went an earlier army, yeah.
I wanted to stay within the 100 Years' War. Yeah, no, if I was just looking at a French ordnance, I would have 2 units of average protected pike in there, and lose something else along the way. Those spearmen wouldn't be there; they would be pikemen. Well, you can't have the spearmen after 1466.
Yes, I suppose it's, if you regarded with the force campaign in what was 1470s as
1475,
an extension of the 100 Years' War.
I thought I'd stick to the traditional.
Well, arguably the French kings supporting Henry Tudor in taking the throne of England was a further extension of the 100 Years' War.
Indeed, if I remember rightly as well, the arms of France were only removed from the British Royal Standard by, was it the Treaty of London in the Napoleonic Wars?
It is certainly, I think, 18th century or something.
18th, early 19th century. 19th. So we could stretch it to the French Revolutionary Wars at least. Might be pushing it. But no, I think it comes back to that point you made, Richard. I think the French ordnance gets better when you get past that 1466.
Yeah.
Or maybe 1465 when a rebel army can have Swiss allies. So.
Indeed. And again, the Milanese only become available in 1466.
Yeah, that's true. Yes,
it is. Yeah. So I want to keep it within the thing. So, yeah. So. Again, possibly a bit of a army. we're not wildly enthusiastic about it. I think maybe just shows the challenges of the 100 Years' War lists.
Yeah, I think it's it's one of, it was certainly, trying to construct the list, it's one of the more challenging periods. In fact, it's a challenging period for rule writers as well.
Yeah, but I think we've said already in this podcast, I think probably the most popular 100 Years' War army is the later 100 Years' War English, with a Burgundian ally, which gets a unit of knights, or knights and custiliers perhaps, who can dismount as fully armoured giant cut and crush, 2 units of pikemen, and a unit of crossbowmen, I believe, is the standard. And that gets bolted onto English with the 2 skilled power bows, a couple of other ones, and some other infantry, depending on your taste. That seems to work quite effectively, because I think the pikemen in there make quite a bit of difference. It gets more fighty. It can stand up to more different armies.
Yep, I'd agree with that.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Matt.
No, I was just going to say, faced enough of them in competition to thoroughly respect that version of the list.
Yeah. I fought quite a few. Not lost to very many, I have to say, but I'm not sure I've beaten very many. I suspect I had a lot of draws, especially if I'm using a mounted type army. Yeah, but it's one of those things. Okay, I think we've probably done those lists to death now, and possibly, I don't know which we say was the most popular. I'm not sure. We'll just leave them as they are. We won't say that. So we'll obviously put those lists will be up on the blog and the supporting material. I think for reading references, we'll wait until the second podcast has been done and do a sort of a whole 100 Years' War one on that, and possibly the same for figures as well. So do it in one big hit. I'm sure we'd be interested to see people's comments on these lists and improved variants that might excite us. Who knows? So I think we've covered that. So we come to us with the traditional any other MEG business.
I think we're all at Devices Week Friday. Well, week this weekend. 17th, is it?
It'll be about a week after this podcast goes live, I suspect. Yeah, 15th, 16th of July. And then after that, Richard, that's when you go on your Anabasis to Historicon, isn't it?
Indeed. I look forward to meeting MEG players in America.
Yeah. So, and if they've got any ideas for podcasts in the future, they can tell you then.
Indeed.
So, yeah. And after Devisers, and when Richard's back, we will hopefully do the second part of this 100 Years War mini-series. And in terms of competitions, obviously, mid-August, BritCon. Open 10,000 point Maximus competition. There is no limit on spaces. So if you haven't entered and are interested, get along, put an entry in. I think the BHS take entries up till really quite late, although it's better for list checking if we get them in a bit earlier, because Matt, you're list checking for that one, aren't you?
I am, and bless Robin, he got the first list in beginning of this week. So Robin gets a gold star, particularly as his list was right on the first attempt. So.
Blimey.
Yeah. It's an omen. I'm not sure.
It's an omen. That's it. Robin. Only list in, first list in, right first time. Plows on and wins the competition.
Yeah.
Anybody giving me any odds on that?
That'll be me thinking an alien's taken over Robin's body.
Ooh.
Sorry, he's abroad.
Most unkind of me.
It's all right. He's abroad drinking sangria or something on a yacht. So
that's why he put his list in, wasn't he? Couldn't remember the date, so he got it in before he went on holiday. So actually, it's a big thank you to Robin for that, for having the consideration to, if you weren't certain, send it in earlier rather than later.
Absolutely.
I am, of course, dithering as usual.
I'll expect your Sultanate of Rum list at any time in the next couple of
I'm not
weeks,
going to take Sultanate of Rum this year.
Honest, Gov.
So I'll send it in next week, shall I? I really have got, it's open competition. I never have a clue. At some point I'll just go, oh, sod it, that one's going in. So yeah. Okay, so gents, as ever, thank you very much for that. Hopefully you, the listener, will have enjoyed this, and we'll be looking forward to the second part, where we will look at, as I said, some of the other participants. No doubt we will cover the Iberian Peninsula, maybe even some other armies in Britain, and we'll have a look around to see what else we can find out there who are taking part in what you might call the wider 100 Years War. So until next time, thank you very much for listening. Enjoy your games. Hopefully might see some of you soon.